Okay, so welcome back to World War Now, everybody. But before you listen into this episode, be sure to realize that the first 50 minutes, 45 minutes or so, I don't know exactly how long, we didn't know about the strikes. The strikes hadn't happened yet. So we were notified of the strikes. We saw when they happened live. So we're keeping this all in so you can listen to the first 45 minutes, our analysis, what we think is going to happen, when we think the strike is going to happen. And I think you'll find it's very prescient based on what immediately transpires. And then we go for the second half of the show analyzing everything that went down, the news as it breaks, what we think is going to happen, as well as, of course, Russia, Ukraine news and church news and other things going on that you, of course, want to hear. So, of course, the New York Times right now has the front page headline, U.S. enters war with Iran. We're getting all sorts of contradictory reports. Trump is addressing the nation. I don't know when you're listening to this, but I'm sure many things have changed and things have developed. But be sure to keep everything in your prayers. Pray for us. The prophecies have been fulfilled. They are being fulfilled. And I think many of you are at this point very much aware of what happens next. And I think the escalations are inevitable. So pray, repent, remember why all these things are happening, and enjoy the show. We'll see you on the other side, and hopefully we will see you on the next one. God bless. Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyin here with another massive World War III update. We are here multiple days, well over a week into the Israel-Iran war as it continues to rage in the Middle East, missiles and drones flying across the Levant all the way from Tel Aviv to Persia and vice versa. We're seeing many things destroyed on both sides, huge water treatment facilities, ports. On the Iranian side, the Iranians have struck hospitals, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, all sorts of high-value targets, all sorts of major assassinations have occurred, of course, on the Iranian side with many nuclear scientists. Again, most of the IRGC, Iranian military, army, navy, air force leadership has been assassinated. The Israelis are now effectively openly going for Ayatollah Khamenei's head. They say that he needs to be taken out, that they no longer accept his regime. Of course, the negotiations continue to, or rather, the United States continues to try for negotiations, but Iran has drawn its line in the sand. They are not accepting a zero domestic enrichment situation, despite that being the U.S. and Israel's demands for them stopping the bombardment and for them to not strike Iran's nuclear capabilities, which the U.S. joining Israel on a strike on Fordo, on the nuclear facilities deep in the mountains there, is what we are awaiting. This episode could become arbitrary at any minute as we are recording this because things could escalate. We are, of course, watching Telegram in real time as we are recording here. We are talking to you as Trump is convening his National Security Council meetings. Seymour Hersh has released his report that it seems that the strike on Iran by the United States with Israel is already a done deal, and that Trump's 2-week deadline that he has stated for making his decision is pretty much just bluster and show, and perhaps even Trump trying to extend things. But, the Israelis made it clear after that 2-week deadline was announced that Trump, that deadline was too much for them and they may take matters into their own hands and strike the nuclear facilities on their own well before that deadline expires. So I'm covering a lot here at the beginning, I know, because things could change at any minute. This is a dynamic situation. The prophecies have been fulfilled, are being fulfilled. World War III is escalating, and it appears that if you listen to Seymour Hersh, Steve Bannon, many other sources, it appears that there's pretty much no going back from this. And by the time you're listening to this, the strike could have either occurred or we will still be on the brink. And either this week or potentially, I think the latest this could occur is maybe this following weekend after you're listening to this. But I think this could be baked into the cake here in the next few days. But Dmitry, obviously, we're going to talk about a few things as well, the Russia stuff, some church news, but all eyes are on Israel and Iran right now. What do you think is going to happen? How are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad, and I can't say the same for the world affairs at the moment because, again, geopolitical escalation is something that essentially increases in complexity and just how intimidating it may become for the average listener to even hear these news. Things are becoming much worse. We're literally in the Third World War right now. I think we can directly say that. It's very accurate. Some of the information that we provide you may seem completely extraordinary in terms of the potential for the U.S. to get involved in another hot war in the Middle East is very real. many analysts, including someone like Lev Vershilin, who is a joint Israeli-Russian political analyst, probably one of the best that Russia has, unfortunately, today. There's not many Russians who analyze Middle Eastern politics very accurately, but he stated that there's a 75% chance that the US will get involved in the war. Many Russians are siding with Iran at the moment. However, the general sentiment is that Russia should most likely stand down and stay away from the conflict. But in terms of the conflict itself, like what we're looking at right now, Conrad, is the greatest missile exchange in the history of Israel and probably the history of Iran as well. Even bigger, I would say, than the military exchanges between Iran and Iraq, which was mainly, you could say, a ground war. It was pre-drone technology. It was before Iran developed and sort of purchased these large quantities of Soviet ballistic missiles. The destruction on either side is massive. And again, this is the unfortunate thing. In the name of the game, possibly even the name of the episode itself, will be fog of war, because that is what we're experiencing here. Many political analysts and news agencies are passing on the same message, that it's not clear what the losses are on either side. Since the previous week, we've discussed how Iran has lost up to 80 people, including the nuclear scientists and military officials. That number has surely increased to hundreds now, if not thousands, because Israel has been actively sending their warplanes over the territory of northern Syria and Iraq. And from the territory of these two sovereign nations, notice the Iraqi government and the Syrian government have done a complete stand down. There's not even a glimpse of a discussion or a point that either of these governments have threatened any of Israel's air force. And it's almost strategically perfect. Israel has taken down the al-Assad government. The plains of Syria and the normalization of the Kurds has essentially forced all the actors in Syria to stand down and watch as these planes fly overhead, shoot their long-range missiles guided at particular targets within Iran itself. The arrests have been massive. Apparently, hundreds of Mossad agents, Mossad assets, everything from Indians to Persians, Turkmen, all kinds of Central Asians, as well as actual Jewish Israelis have been arrested by the Iranian government. There's been very quick hangings. We've seen people hung off cranes. Tribunals have been passing death sentences, executions in Iran, which is understandable. There's literally a war going on, and this is we have to call it what it is, Conrad. This is the biggest war in the Middle East that we've seen, possibly even larger than the Syrian revolutionary escalation in December in terms of exchangement of missiles, bombs, and the loss of life, as I said, on both sides is very vague. In Tel Aviv, we're definitely sure that at least, according to Colonel McGregor and other analysts, that at least a third of the city has been somewhat impacted or at least touched by Iranian missiles. And I say that very lightly. But mind you, the danger of Iran's bombardment of Israel is that all of the Israeli official government headquarters are essentially located in Western Jerusalem, so the new city of Jerusalem, and it's intermixed between Jerusalem essentially and Haifa, but Tel Aviv being the economic hub, being the place where most of the elites live, of the Israeli elites, and essentially the heart of Israel is definitely still in Tel Aviv. It's very telling that Iran in particular is aiming for the city with a majority Israeli Jewish population, because they simply do not want to, again, harm their co-religionists, the Palestinians, which again would cause a huge upstir and uprising. There's all kinds of rumors going on. I see on the Orthodox Christian Russian internet, people are mentioning how a false flag could take out the Al-Aqsa Mosque potentially. Maybe the Israelis themselves, that is, will destroy the mosque on the Dome of the Rock in order to, again, push forward this hyper-Zionist dispensationalist prophecy of rebuilding the third temple, this sort of Freemasonic design that they've been looking at for generations. But at the moment, Conrad, the biggest fear that people do have is the reality of a nuclear exchange, right? And the two nuclear powers at the moment who are involved, and I'm not even going to discuss Pakistan, which has sent very mixed messages, frankly, about this particular issue, is Israel and the US. So which country will utilize nuclear weaponry first if it comes to that? And what exactly will force either of these nations to escalate to that particular potential? What is a Hiroshima-Nagasaki scenario? Would it be an assassination of a top official of America? Would it be the necessity of a ground invasion jointly alongside a massive nuclear strike? And again, how desperate would Israel get before they would utilize one of their bomber planes to drop a nuclear bomb on Iranian territory? Because at the moment, Conrad, and we've seen reports that Israel has multiple times informed all the citizens of Tehran, which is a multi-million person metropolis city. There's millions of people living in Tehran, the capital of Iran. They've told everyone to leave. I'm not sure if that's even possible. How can millions of people simply abandon even the Kievan Ukrainians, so to speak, couldn't leave Kiev when the special military operation began. It's irresponsible to tell the people of the capital city just to leave simply because you're choosing to bomb that particular location. They've done the same to Gaza, and that's caused essentially, that's brought about thousands of deaths. But Israel is acting essentially as the one who's escalated the conflict to a point of essentially no return. It doesn't look like either side can turn down what has essentially already started and has come into almost complete fruition. But what we're looking at, Conrad, the second most dangerous scenario here is the US getting involved, but not in the standard way as we would expect, where the US would send, ground troops like in Iraq or Afghanistan. No, the US most likely, if it does open up and Trump does play his hand and supports Bibi Netanyahu's old-time friend, or, they had a hate-love relationship, I suppose, with the last few years, would be to use the B-2 stealth bombers from Diego Garcia, which are ready to go, and of course utilize the heaviest bunker-busted bombs that are available to the U.S. Air Force and Army, which are very heavy. These munitions can penetrate deep underground, and in particular, there's one target which everyone has been discussing. This is the most well-known Iranian underground nuclear facility, where allegedly the Iranians have the potential to enrich uranium to such a level that uranium can be weaponized and turned into nuclear munitions and nuclear bombs that can be allegedly then potentially used against Israel. It's the Fordo base located in Iran. So there's a lot of discussions about the B-2 bombers from Diego Garcia essentially being used in that capacity. And this is how speculation is that the US will enter the war through these B-2 bombers flying over Iranian territory high in the sky, apparently because they're stealth bombers, right? So Iranian air defense systems, including the Russian S-400 system, which some have speculated could hypothetically hit and lock onto F-35s and other stealth fighters, and these B-2 bombers would fly over and drop these bombs onto Iranian territory, and US would officially enter into the war. Now, we have to just briefly mention, Conrad, that I don't believe the US would openly declare war, congressionally speaking, on Iran. It'll be similar to the Iraq War, where it'll be deemed a sort of peacekeeping interventionist operation to defend an ally in the region or something of this sort, because, again, how the modern world works is all sides are hyper-hypocritical, and they utilize these various political jargon talking points in order to mask their true intentions. So I don't think an actual war will be declared, but a special military operation by the US is very highly likely. In my estimation, at least 66% plus that the US may enter into this war, and potentially in that time frame that Trump recently put out, in the next 2 weeks, maybe even sooner than that. It could be in the next hour after we finish this recording.
No, it's true. Again, real-time situation here. I hope that everything we're bringing you is still somewhat relevant by the time you are listening to this. But you mentioned Diego Garcia. As we speak right now, B-2 bombers and multiple affiliated planes, because of course these bombers are going to have to be deployed with squadrons of fighter jets, because again, they may be stealthy, but they're not the stealthiest planes in the world. The reason they're necessary is for their payload capability. They're the only bombers that are big enough to carry these huge MOP bunker busters that are 30,000 plus pounds each, going to be able to carry two of those that can actually do the damage that they want to try to get it to do on the Fordo underground facility, which is at least 300 plus feet underground, not including the extra granite layers from the mountain peaks that are on top of it. That's 300 below sea level, below the actual surface of the earth. So very deep underground military base. Some people are saying that if America does this, it'll have to be a tactical nuclear device that does this. I'm not going to put any bets or money on that, but some people are saying it will have to be even bigger than the largest conventional weapons that we have. And the fact that right now these bombers are on Guam, that actually has them in range. In theory, they could do it from Guam. I don't think they want to. They'd probably rather do it from Diego Garcia, but it is possible from Guam with the range of these bombers and the fueling capabilities and whatnot. So we're watching all of that very, very closely. Of course, the big question outside of when is the U.S. going to go in, will Israel do it on their own? How will Iran respond? Everyone's thinking about that because we're already in the midst of that. As we speak, Iran is retaliating. Israel's retaliating back. People stopped keeping track of the salvos because it's just war, which we predicted months ago would eventually break out. I think at one point I saw Iran launches its 17th salvo. I'm like, all right, at this point, people are going to stop keeping track. People are just perpetually firing, firing at will, as it were, seems to be almost what's occurring. So the question outside of the immediate parties involved is how will Russia, China, even Turkey, some of these other neighborhood actors actually respond? And of course, Putin, he made a lot of remarks on this at that recent economic summit going on in Russia. He talked about how Iran never asked for military assistance. They even were offered assistance in the realm of air defense and they turned it down. They did express support for them in the realm of civilian nuclear pursuits. They talked about how there are many, even hundreds of Russian nuclear scientists currently in Bashir and at other Iranian nuclear sites, which I think should be a relevant defense concern for Russians, considering how many Iranian nuclear scientists have been openly murdered and killed by the Israeli regime in these targeted airstrikes. So, interesting remark there. But then I think one of the more disappointing remarks, and Putin did, obviously he talked about wanting to de-escalate. He did call the U.S. and told them that, assassinating the Ayatollah, which is currently what Israel wants to do, it's on the table. He said that that is a red line and that Iran's nuclear facilities shouldn't be struck. The Russians are openly saying that to the U.S. They explicitly told the U.S., though, this isn't a threat. This is just our advice. So clearly they're trying to not have their Iran diplomacy affect what they are trying to pursue diplomatically with the U.S. over the Ukraine situation. But the U.S., yes, they are effectively supporting Israel's attempts to assassinate the Ayatollah. Trump said, of course, that he hasn't done it yet. He's still looking out for it, and the Ayatollah is currently in a bunker. He's reportedly appointed 3 successors. I've heard that his son, who is a leading figure in the IRGC, is not one of these 3 successors. So I haven't seen a list of who these people are. I doubt they would release that publicly. That would seem like a pretty stupid thing to do, considering how many of these people have been taken out. But I'm sure these people are distributed across Iran, ready to take control remotely if Ayatollah Khamenei is to come to an unfortunate end at this time. But I think one of the most unfortunate comments that Putin made that really does explain why Russia is fundamentally has its hands tied behind its back when it comes to the Israel issue, is when he said that Israel is effectively a Russian-speaking country based on how many Israelis, how many Jews have come from Russia and the USSR that live there. I think it's over 2 million people, of course, in Israel speak Russian. Bibi Netanyahu speaks better Russian than he speaks English. So this is something we always need to remember, that even though Russia is clearly diplomatically, yes, siding with Iran, calling Israel's actions illegal, unfortunately, from a civilizational perspective, Russia is somewhat tied at the hip to Israel.
No, absolutely. And, we have had those Shoigu visits of Iran over the entirety of 2024, essentially, since he was replaced as the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. And there has been that collaboration. And Iran has, in fact, ratified officially the Iran's Guardian Council, essentially the constitutional oversight body, has confirmed the Russian military treaty of sorts that it has with Iran has officially come into power now. It's come into effect essentially almost at the same time as the escalation in the war has essentially commenced, and True Promise 3 has begun, which is interesting timing, but I don't think this will change anything. As you said, Conrad, I think the considerations of the Russian Federation are much more complicated than that. I mean, people are raising very big questions, such as Russia has had several economic deals with Iran. We know Iran has sold thousands of Shahed drones to Russia over the last few years, even before the special military operation, is my guess, but most likely since the beginning of that operation, because they were utilized, remember, at the end, during that Surovikin era, when we actually started the podcast in September, October, November of 2022. So most likely the Russian-Iranian relationship really improved quite a bit since the beginning of the SMO. However, Russia also confirmed sales of Sukhoi S-35 planes, not F-35, but S-35. These are essentially, they're better than F-16s, I would say. It's a post-COVID designed, you could almost say, Russian warplane. 50 of them have officially been sold to Iran. However, their location at the moment is under question. We've not seen these planes in action. Iran has not flown any planes over Iraq or Syria, any warplanes. At the moment, the combat which we're seeing from Iran's side is strictly via long-range Shahed drones. These are better than the cheap Shahed drones they're selling the Russians, because the Russians needed just drones in mass, like in quantity, and the cheapest they could probably get from Iran, which Iran, of course, was capable of mass producing. But Iran also has those long-range drones that can fly 1,000 kilometers, probably even further than that. We've seen them actually fly into Haifa buildings. We've seen explosions all over Israel from both ballistic missiles as well as Iranian long-range drones. And these are the drones that have been getting shot down by Qatari, Emirati, Jordanian, and I would even assume US US warplanes over the Middle East as they're flying over, because again, they take a very long time to actually reach their targets. So it's very interesting how the entire conflict is escalating whilst the Russian-Iranian relationship is in a state of flux. And the reason why we mention this is because, again, the Russian position in the Middle East has been significantly somewhat weakened since their deep isolation in the Khmeimim and the Tartus bases after the fall of the Assad regime. And we understand now that that was part of the greater plan of Israel's escalation against Iran. There's no denying that. And I think Syrian Girl and Alia's predictions on our show were entirely correct. The fall of Syria was only one of the dominoes that needed to collapse before this greater escalation. And Israel could have used any pretext to escalate. The bombing of the Ben Gurion airport by the Houthis, generally any bombing by either Hezbollah or the Houthis could be blamed on Iran. These are Iranian proxies, so to speak. Officially, this is how it's reported. They've even called Hamas an Iranian proxy. But the reality on the ground, Conrad, is that if the US does get involved, there are actually real Iranian proxies located in Iraq, maybe even in eastern Syria, but definitely in Iraq surrounding, for example, the Al-Assad or the Erbil base. Iraq is very much, shall we say, a very loosely governed territory. And as recently reported on an interview Tucker Carlson had, there's a potential that the U.S. troops stationed in Iraq and Syria will be put under immediate risk and threat if the U.S. joins into this conflict, because again, Iran will aim not just ballistic missiles, maybe even against U.S. bases. This time around, I think that Iran will probably utilize hypersonic missiles. And this isn't just a speculation. Iran has already utilized hypersonic missiles. We've seen footage of that as they've smashed into Tel Aviv over the last week. And you can tell the difference because even on footage, the hypersonic missiles are 20 times plus faster than the regular ballistic missiles. They're literally faster than the speed of light. You can see them smash into their targets. Air defense cannot stop them. The Iron Dome, I think we can kind of stop speaking about this particular contraption now at this point. It has certainly been overwhelmed to some extent. I'm sure the Israelis are still utilizing that, and they're very thankful for the massive THAAD launches that the Biden administration has gifted them, because they're probably working overtime. I can assume they're almost running out of munitions at this point, given how many ballistics that Iran has been launching at Israel. But the real concern, of course, is the two aircraft carrier groups located around Iran's strike range. So this is the USS Nimitz, which officially has arrived into the Middle East. It's already in the zone of operations. And again, the USS Carl Vinson, the USS Harry Truman, I believe, has left the Middle East at the moment after the Houthi operation has kind of wound down a little bit in the Red Sea. So these two aircraft carriers, and Russians have been reporting this for over 6 years now, since the, design and popularization of hypersonic missiles. The speed of these missiles essentially allows them to hit, and the nature of these missiles essentially allows them to hit targets which, before the targets can even move or reposition themselves. These are better than, for example, those HIMARS situation in Ukraine, where the HIMARS shoots its missiles at a particular Russian target, and the Russian target can actually move out of the way in time before the HIMARS strike arrives. It's not the same with hypersonics. The hypothetical scenario, Conrad, that we spoke about, the huge black swan event, this is the new 9/11 for the US, as if an Iranian hypersonic hits the USS Carl Vinson or the USS Nimitz aircraft carriers. This would mean over 5,000 to 6,000 Americans will die, and most likely there'll be a huge uproar in America. This will be greater than 9/11. It'll be the greatest loss of American life in decades. And I think we're actually looking at that potential. Why? Because Iran has been holding back on this hypersonic missile use. A lot of these ballistics they've been launching at Israel have been older, almost Soviet Cold War era ballistic missiles. People have reported, well, what if Iran simply runs out of missiles to shoot at Israel? Well, Iran's not Hezbollah. Iran has local domestic missile production. It's also been stockpiling these missiles since the Iran-Iraq war. It has, some people have estimated, close to 1 million stored munitions of various types and sizes. And as long as they can fly all the way to the Israeli territory, this will be satisfactory for the regime. The hypersonics, what could they be used for? Well, I think the American bases stationed in Bahrain, stationed in Qatar, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, stationed again, Iraq, Syria, as well as those two aircraft carriers, if they can potentially lock in and aim on them. I think the loss of American life is very much on the table. So Trump should really consider that. And I think he is. And this is why the U.S. administration there's a lot of mixed signals, right? You see people like Steve Bannon, who generally he does have a very pro-Zionist position. Even he's very wary of what might happen. We have the complete fallout between Tucker Carlson and Trump, essentially almost like a more serious fallout than the one Elon Musk and Donald J. Trump had in recent weeks. And everyone is very concerned about the possible escalation, what that may mean for America in the long term. We're not leaving out the potential of a false flag that could lead America into a war, either a strike against an American base, the utilization of Mossad assets within the U.S. This has been confirmed recently in the Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz interview, where Ted Cruz essentially says, well, yeah, of course Mossad is spying on us, which means that, yes, there are Mossad operatives on U.S. soil. There could be false flag attacks. The 2 Trump assassinations have already been quasi-blamed on Iran by none other than the vice president himself, J.D. Vance. So there's already a rhetorical groundwork set. There's a foundation for massive blame on Iran for various deeds that they may commit allegedly on U.S. soil. So we just have to keep that in mind. Israel very much wants to bring the U.S. into war. But you know who benefits from all of this the most, Conrad? It's, of course, Netanyahu and his cabinet. This, essentially, what's taking place now is a complete justification for them, at least to their Israeli hyper-Zionist and also hawkish citizens, that their actions against Hezbollah, against the so-called Assad regime, the evil Assadists, the Iranian allies, and against Hamas have been completely justified because Israel was trying to prevent what's taking place now. They can frame this very, very lucratively in their own favor and, fruitfully so. But again, all the protests in Israel, the gay parades have been cancelled in the so-called month of the gay pride month of June. There's been a lot of Israelis running to the bunkers all week long. There's a lot of complaints being thrown around. Israelis, by the way, do have safe rooms. Every single apartment building in Tel Aviv, if I'm not mistaken, even older apartment buildings do have special steel or heavy concrete created safe rooms, which is probably why the Israeli losses are actually less so in quantity than the Iranian losses, because as we discussed last week, Iran actually wasn't really preparing for World War III as much as Israel was, which I think speaks to the fact that Israel was trying to provoke an outstanding strike against its Middle Eastern neighbors and those in the vicinity in the region for a very long time now. So we just have to keep in mind that whatever happens next, the U.S. involvement will be crucial in how this entire operation proceeds and progresses, because Israel at the moment, it's very limited. Israel has over 289, close to 300 warplanes. So these are F-16s, F-18s, and of course about 41 F-35 stealth air fighters that it can utilize, and it has been utilizing to bomb Iranian territory. Iran has completely lost all access to the internet. The internet coverage in Iran has dropped, I think, something like 95%, which is very interesting. I'm not sure if that's the Iranian government working on that, or if Israel has struck certain internet provider buildings, etc., in order to shut the country down communication-wise, which brings me into question, Conrad, as to why the Russian Federation didn't do the same thing when the special military operation commenced in Ukraine, right? So a lot of very questionable decisions there. And the comparison is very interesting, that this is probably what a real war would look like in terms of it actually commencing and both sides taking out key strategic targets. And there's a lot of fake news, Conrad. There's been a fake news story that the former president of Iran was killed at his farm home. Ahmadinejad was assassinated. He then had to release an official video for Iranian citizens, essentially claiming that, I'm actually still alive. There's claims that, of course, more nuclear scientists have been officially murdered, Iranian officials. Iranian folks have also been spreading strange news online that Ben-Gvir, for example, has been killed. The head of Mossad was assassinated. All these news are essentially unproven at this point. Neither side is confirming which higher officials have been taken out in recent days. So we have to keep that in mind. A lot of these reports they could be essentially just military misinformation. I wouldn't necessarily call it lying. It's almost like a high degree of spycraft and essentially wartime intelligence disinformation being used in order to gain an upper hand against your adversary. So I can't really blame either side for necessarily using this sort of technology. And we just have to keep in mind that there's an interesting, there was a very apt. This is probably the only protest we actually saw in Israel, Conrad. There's footage of Ben-Gvir and the head of Mossad, David Barnea, actually debating on the streets. I think it was most likely in Jerusalem. They were actually fighting on the streets, arguing, and the Mossad director was essentially blaming Ben-Gvir for escalating the conflict, and Ben-Gvir was basically crying, and they were both fighting about the conflict and which side escalated, and not necessarily shifting it to Netanyahu. So there's fighting going on within the Israeli government. There's a potential that it's always available, the chance that his rule may be overturned. He does look very concerned. He looks very almost sleep deprived in his recent video that he's released. And, it's very telling that either side, we could see a potential coup, top-down overthrowing of a government, either from the Iranian side or the Israeli side, as the conflict progresses and both sides experience huge amounts of public as well as internal governmental stress. So what's happening right now is probably even larger than the events of December when the Assad regime fell, and dare I say, even more militarily significant than the Israeli escalation in Lebanon, as well as the Israeli, again, genocide against the Palestinians. Again, the loss of life is not equal to that of the Palestinian Gazans that the Israelis have incurred upon them. However, this may lead into something much, much worse than that in the next few coming, well, I have to say hours, if not days.
No, yeah, this is all very dynamic of a situation. And of course, you mentioned the situation in Israel and the strikes going on there. Of course, recently, Israeli officials have admitted that the interception rate for Iranian missiles by Israeli air defense has gone from 90% over 24-hour periods all the way down to 65%. So, despite the fact that Israel is deploying wartime propaganda implying that simultaneously Iran is a superpower about to nuke them powerfully and are currently being completely destroyed, and that their entire military has now effectively been wiped out by the powerful Israeli strikes. Well, both of the things can't be true at once. And of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But the Iranian strategy of slowly but surely, with big strikes occasionally and then these smaller 6 to 15 missile salvo strikes has been dismantling and slowly draining the Israeli interceptor arsenal to the point where when they do unleash the real barrage of hypersonics that they have, hundreds of at least, then the Israeli air defense is going to be far less prepared. But as all of this is going on, I was, of course, listening to Dimitri's analysis while watching, the news feed, and apparently, Israel has struck air defense positions near the Fordo nuclear facility in the calm countryside. They are also attempting to destroy the Isfahan atomic energy facilities. So I don't know if these are preparatory strikes. Obviously, when they attempt to strike Fordo, they're going to try to do it with a clear shot. So I'm assuming they're going to be trying to clear out all of these air defenses because, as I've been saying, I was saying this to Dimitri off stream, everyone's treating it like it's a done deal. Like if Iran wants to strike, or rather if the U.S. wants to strike the Fordo facility with Israel, that it will just work 100%. And I agree that based on everyone's understanding of United States military superiority, it makes sense that, non-military educated people would assume this. But as someone, just trying to game this out in my head, I don't see it as like 100% guarantee that it will go exactly as they want. I'm not saying that the Iranians will shoot everyone out of the sky and achieve total victory, but are they going to be able to hit it exactly on target, 100%, actually destroy the site? Are all of the planes that fly with them, the bomber itself and, its accompanying fighters, are they going to be able to all make it? Will some of them get shot down sooner? What will happen if someone's taken prisoner? I mean, the Israelis are talking about doing a commando raid with like people on the ground. I don't even know what that would look like. Is there a evacuation plan? Are they going to get these guys out? Are these sleeper cell MK Ultra suicide super soldiers? Like, who is being deployed to Fordo to lay charges and destroy this? I don't really, I'm no military expert, so maybe somebody more plugged in on the tactical side can plug us in the comments. But I'm very curious as to, how this is going to go down. And, for example, the Israelis, they are going to have to do a much more complex operation if they go it alone, because they simply will not have the tonnage that American bombing, accompaniment will bring them. So that's the situation there. But you mentioned the disinformation, all of the misinformation. The one I'm most curious about is how many of these Israeli F-16s, how many of these Israeli jets have actually been shot down by the Iranians? Because they're claiming, what is it, up to 5 at this point? And I haven't exactly seen evidence for anything. I've seen some evidence that maybe one likely did go down in some capacity, but it doesn't appear to me like the Iranians have been able to recover that wreckage. If they shot it down, perhaps it then fell into Syria, into Iraq, into Jordan, somewhere where the Israelis or the United States would be able to recover it for them. So I don't know the truth on there. It seems to me that something did happen. I don't think they'd be claiming 5 if not a single one had been shot down. So something clearly occurred there, which, that alone shows that this is not exactly an Israeli rout of the Iranians. Sure, they are able to engage in much more targeted strikes on much higher level officials, and it appears that Iran hasn't really reciprocated in the realm of assassinations. But besides that, Iran is effectively showing that it is at a missile level more powerful than Israel from a strict back and forth perspective, because they are able to launch these massive salvos despite not having the jets and these other launching capabilities that have been supplied to Israel, of course, by the United States. And is Iran having to become this domestic missile military industrial factory is obviously going to serve them very well as they continue to have to kind of pull in and put up the porcupine spikes as what seems to be the inevitable attack from the United States comes. And you're right, Dimitri, what will trigger how much this is treated like a war, whether war is officially declared or not, is going to depend on how many Americans die. We're already seeing reports about Americans injured in Israel from falling debris from intercepted Iranian missiles. So, the playing field is being set for people to associate Americans in the region as being attacked by these Iranian strikes. And again, all of these bases that you mentioned in Bahrain, Qatar, most of these places have almost been entirely emptied out. So Trump knows he's trying to prevent civilian casualties because he knows that when this strike happens, Iran will retaliate. And that when the retaliation occurs, that's when the pressure from home is going to come to escalate. Because right now, he has the people on his side to not escalate. The only people really itching to escalate are, besides Jews and certain evangelicals, are CENTCOM it's themselves, obviously the AIPAC lobby, Congress, certain members of Congress and these people. So those are the people itching for it right now. But let's say 500 U.S. soldiers are dead 2 weeks from now. I think you're going to have a lot more normies, people that aren't really plugged into the deep truths of politics. They're going to be like, all right, we gotta show these mullahs who's boss and not let them, kill our people. So that's going to be a big question. And of course, the moment we strike in any capacity, Iran is going to be obligated to retaliate. So I think the fact that what we're seeing right now, and this is from the New York Times, it says the recent Israeli strikes in the past hours in Iran were aimed at thwarting potential threats that could endanger American fighter aircraft in an attack on the nuclear facility in Fordo. So that's from the New York Times. In this type of situation, they are going to be better informed than most because they have people just inside the White House, inside the decision-making room, probably in Tel Aviv. So you got to listen to the Jewish-owned media when it comes to things like this at this stage in the game, because they're going to be hearing it first. And if they're openly talking about American fighters, then I think Steve Bannon, Seymour Hersh, even a few other sources, their claims that this is already baked into the cake. Trump has even already given the order itself. We're just waiting on the trigger to actually be pulled on the timing. Then this report kind of makes sense. So if that's where we're at, and I think Dimitri and I are on the same page that's the current stage on the meter, on the clock, then again, I'm sorry, I'm not in shock right now. It's just I'm almost just waiting for it to pop up on my feed that the strike has happened. But we might have to see some more plane movements before that occurs. But I mean, what do the prophecies say? What does Metropolitan Neovito say? He says that the Russians and the Chinese will be forced to respond. Like, not that they will eagerly respond, as we've been saying, but things will occur to the point where they will basically be forced to take action that they otherwise would not want to. But again, from a geopolitical perspective, Russia simply can't allow the Iranian regime to fall. And we have Congress meeting with representatives of Reza Pahlavi, the former Shah of Iran's heir, the now liberal, pro-Zionist, monarchist, in exile movement that that hopes that it can take power in Iran, facilitated by the U.S. and Israel. And if Russia has this happen to them, I mean, they are getting surrounded. Their entire southern flank is falling. They're losing major allies. I mean, Iran supplies them with major military components for the special military operation. So again, Russia is clearly doing everything it can, talking about how much it loves the Jews that live in Israel, talking about, sending America polite recommendations to not strike Iran. But fundamentally, they cannot allow the Iranian regime to fall. In the situation that has transpired right now, maybe there's somehow a chance that America doesn't get directly involved and Israel does the strike on the Fordo facility on its own. Regardless, there's no way that the current Iranian regime survives in its current form. Maybe it survives without Ayatollah Khamenei at its head. Maybe it gets overthrown in a sort of compromise capacity with the liberals and with some of these more Islamist characters. But I can't see how any peace or any ceasefire or any just general moving on from this stage of the conflict occurs with the current Ayatollah in power and the current regime in place, as it were, without the U.S. coming in and then Russia and everybody else getting involved. So if Russia sees that that is going to happen, I don't know exactly what that looks like for them. Maybe it just means they start rapidly escalating in Ukraine to the point where the U.S. can't ignore it. I'm curious your thoughts, Dimitri, on what you think Russia's options are if they did want to aid Iran, or if they were backed into a corner to where they feel they need to provide some sort of security for the regime there. But I mean, based on what we saw occur in Syria, it's not exactly the most comforting thing for the Iranians to look at when it comes to viewing Russia as an ally. Obviously, China, that's the big question everybody has been asking, is what is China doing? They obviously have been not like much like the Russians, they haven't been, openly saying that we're going to defend Iran to no end. They've been saying the same kinds of things. Israel's actions are illegal. Iran in some capacity has a right to defend itself. But the real talk has been about these planes that have been turning off their transponders, landing in Iran, coming from China. And the question is, have they been providing military equipment? I've seen news that some of them were large enough to be providing some form of substantial military assistance. I don't know if this is air defense. I don't know if this is, economic assistance of some kind. But the real question is, how much is China, discreetly, of course, aiding the Iranians right now? So the question of how much they will do that in the future come an American strike is also up in the air. But if I had to guess right now, it appears that while Russia is open to more talking about the issue publicly because they realize they're not really doing anything, China keeping its mouth shut because behind the scenes, I think it is doing a little bit more than Russia, because China is more dependent on Iranian energy than Russia perhaps is on whatever it is receiving from Iran, whether it's military equipment, economic assistance. I mean, for a while they were receiving food, and you'd see Farsi Sprite and Coke products in Moscow for a while during peak sanctions. So Iran and Russia are obviously very close, so we're going to have to see how all of this goes. But big breaking news here, the B-2s are not likely to land in Guam. They will continue heading westwards. So that's a big update. That means that the strike is even more likely to occur, because while I said Guam is in range, Diego Garcia is much closer. Diego Garcia has always been sort of his designated zone, known for how it can strike Iran specifically. So that's what's going on right now. It appears that, again, maybe they get there, maybe they stay there for a day or two and strike, maybe they land there, refuel, and go directly towards Iran. We don't really know. So we're going to be tracking these planes. Obviously, follow the World War Now Telegram to keep track of all these things at World War Now Telly. But we're going to be keeping you posted. But Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what China is doing and what you think about what really is occurring with some of these supposedly shot down planes and everything else going on right now.
Yeah, no, very apt analysis, Conrad. You're completely correct that if F-35s, Israeli F-35s were in fact shot down, as they were speculating, between 3 and 6 of them, maybe, something, a lot of reports are giving us number 5. If they were shot down, most likely they did fall on Syrian or Iraqi territory, which is, again, friendly to the Israelis. I doubt. However, Iran could have utilized some of those local proxy groups, which it does have in Iraq, set up by Soleimani in decades past, that could potentially, influence something on the ground there. However, yes, I doubt that Iran would have evidence of that. In any case, both sides have essentially commenced to suppress all information. As we know, Tel Aviv, Israeli territory in general, you simply are not allowed to film any of the destruction. You can face criminal charges, not just some administrative fines in Israel at the moment. So I'm not sure if Iran is approaching it in the same fashion, but both sides have taken this approach of essentially blacking out any sort of information about the ongoing conflict in order to, again, prevent espionage tactics by their respective opponents. So that's very clear. In relation to China, Conrad, I think it's very clear that China has a much closer economic relationship with Iran than, say, Russia does with Iran. So that's the connection. If Iran is lost to China as a potential economic ally, I wouldn't say military ally, no, not at all, then the future of China's presence in the Middle East could definitely be weakened. That entire Silk Road project, or sort of the Great Belt and Road project that China is essentially has been working on for the last decade, can be put into massive question. And China's other ally, Pakistan, could have potentially been using some of this pro-Iranian rhetoric on request by China, actually, as a regional power. So we keep that in mind. I think China's trying to pressure the US and Israel diplomatically through some of its media sources in order to stand down, in order to resolve this diplomatically. But I don't believe either side will, in this particular conflict, will listen necessarily. I think Iran has definitely shown this somewhat admirable stubbornness. Like, we have to keep in mind, it's almost like all of Iran has somewhat united, at least on the public PR and on the, to us, listeners, viewers, people who actually have to consume a lot of this information from the ground. It looks like Pezeshkian, Abbas Araghchi, Khamenei, the supreme leader, they've all united around this idea that Iran needs to stand up for its sovereignty, needs to defend itself against Israel and carry out true promise free, will continue until essentially Israel essentially surrenders, right? So this is the stance that Iran has taken on a unified front. I don't think any pressure China applies to Iran will necessarily matter at this point, because again, Iran, one of the most sanctioned countries, has definitely been essentially disrespected and humiliated many times over the past few decades by all kinds of powers. And not even decades, I would say hundreds of years, most likely since the Russian Revolution. Because you have to keep in mind, ever since the Russian Revolution, Iran has fallen deeply under the influence of both the British and the US until the 1979 revolution, when the Iranians essentially obtained this weird, radical Shia Islamic type of independence, and they've become a so-called rogue state over 46 years ago. So before that point, between the Russian Revolution and 1979, Iran under the Shahs was unfortunately very deeply under Western control. It was essentially like one of the Gulf states you see today. That would be the most apt analysis. And I think in some ways, this current strike against Iran is trying to bring this once subservient country back into line, if not completely eliminated. I think the Israelis most likely have an elimination goal. And this aligns with Strelkov's analysis here, Conrad, where he says that essentially he states that China could potentially significantly aid Iran, possibly prevent its defeat by providing Iran with air defense missiles and air defense launchers, the equivalent, of course, to any S-300, S-400 systems that China does have and that it domestically produces, most likely of a lower quality than, say, the Russian air defense systems. But that is the number one thing that Iran needs right now. It needs air defense, it needs missile defense systems on the ground defensively so that it can protect not just these nuclear facilities out in the desert, but also some of the official military bases, maybe even actual cities, which again, Israel has been striking Tehran itself, right? So again, suburbs, probably a lot of civilians have been dying, most likely, as we said, thousands of people. So this is one thing China can definitely provide Iran, and one thing maybe Russia could too, if again, we don't really know. We haven't heard of any Ilyushin planes or any massive cargo planes flying, or even any ships crossing the Caspian Sea carrying any aid from Russia to Iran over the last week. So again, some of our hopes may have been shattered against rocks that, Russia will, close in its ties with Iran and begin to cooperate. And the mutual relationship, Conrad, between Russia and Iran could be put into question by the fact that Russia always has been collaborating very closely, not just with the Israelis, but with the internal Zionist Jewish lobby. Like, Russia has literally, the Russian media is controlled to a large extent by domestic Jews who have joint Israeli citizenships. Not just Lev Vershilin, who I mentioned, but Vladimir Solovyov-Shapiro, who recently, funny enough, despite being a joint Israeli-Russian citizen, so to speak, and he loves going to Israel, etc., and him being a Talmudic Jew, he has pushed a very pro-Iranian message on Russian TV. So Russian Channel 24, Channel 1 have been pushing a very pro-Iranian message. They have been taking, strangely enough, the Jews in Russia are pushing a pro-Iranian position. I think most likely because they're actually completing orders on behalf of some of the higher-ups in Russia are essentially stating that, yes, Russia needs to be promoting a pro-Iranian message across the board. But we have to understand these people have dual loyalties. And how did the Iranians view them, right? The Iranians most likely view Russia with suspicion. That's the other problem, not just because Russia and Iran have had a complicated history, but it's a two-way street. And unfortunately, I think this will not serve Iran very well. I think Iran needs to, in some ways, blindly trust some of its potential allies in the near future if it wants to gain an upper hand against Israel, which is supported by the entirety of NATO, you can almost say, despite not being a member of NATO. So we just have to keep in mind that, as Strelkov said, like he officially stated Russia has publicly distanced itself from Iran, and it may offer limited intelligence supports, but it's currently so tied down in Ukraine that Russia will not be able to assist Iran heavily in terms of military weaponry. Obviously, Iran doesn't need tanks; it doesn't need Russian troops on the ground. The only thing Iran would really benefit from right now is, yes, that's correct, intelligence, anti-missile technology, anti-air launchers, something of this sort, which again would shut down any Israeli attempts and maybe even U.S. attempts from essentially striking at these key infrastructural targets. The other interesting point I'll just mention quickly is that Strelkov said that the way Israel and the U.S. may actually act in the next few weeks or even days, would that they're going to target a lot of Iran's infrastructure, logistics, essentially create like a Yugoslavia 1999 model where they're going to take out or at least threaten key structures and objectives within Iran in order to destabilize the nation from inside, essentially cause a complete shutdown of any civilian facilities, which is something Russia hasn't done in Ukraine, which is why, notice, we may even think that, hey, well, if Ukraine wasn't completely destroyed and annihilated by Russia in the span of a week or two, therefore Israel can't do the same to Iran. But that's probably because, well, frankly, Russia has been either incompetent or has taken a very humanitarian position in the entire special military operation. Israel and the US have the opportunity to devastate Iran very quickly. Russia has the same with Ukraine, it's just refused to do so. So a lot of people have been making these analogies and comparisons. I think they're exactly apt, very on point. So we have to keep in mind, Conrad, I think, going back to which country will assist Iran the most, it's very clear at the moment that China has actually been bringing something into Iran. What exactly, we're not sure. But those planes have been turning off their transponders. They have been landing on Iranian territory, and that's confirmed. The other big sort of news story about planes, and this is one of the reasons why, not just the B-2 bombers, making big moves and the USS Nimitz arriving in CENTCOM, the scariest thing was those, again, massive planes which refuel fighter jets in the air, moving from the US, flying across the Atlantic, and again, disappearing essentially off the map. They're either flying to Germany, to Europe, or they're flying to the Middle East. It's unclear exactly, but these particular planes can guarantee a long-range US/Israeli bombarding campaign of Iran if this moves forward. Again, if this was just a show of force by the Trump administration, Conrad, I would maybe say, well, this is just a practice operation, a simulation of some sort, right? However, just moving these massive planes from the, tens of planes, up to 40 of them over the past week from US soil across the Atlantic, this is millions of taxpayer dollars going, essentially just being burnt up in fuel, in terms of logistics, salaries, and all these things. It's unrealistic that the US is simply trying to scare Iran into submission. It's very clear to me, at least, that the US is preparing for something, at least, and unfortunately I have to just say it, it's looking very likely that a joint operation by the United States and Israel in the near future is a possibility. We have to keep in mind, officially the Gulf states, by taking out Iranian missiles and drones, attempting to, especially the UAE and Qatar in the last week, they've officially also entered into the war. They've just like Hezbollah has proclaimed that it's not neutral and it's pro-Iranian, Qatar, the UAE, most likely Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, despite, Saudi Arabia has kept its cool for now. But we know most likely if the conflict does break out, they will join Israel and the US. They simply benefit too much from Iran being taken down in this particular conflict, especially when they won't need to spend as much money doing so. They're simply a supplementary assistant in this massive Third World War at this point, despite the fact that Iran may very well have hypersonic ballistic missiles right now aimed at Saudi air bases and Saudi airports and military bases, just ahead of time, simply, calibrating their aim, looking down the barrel, so to speak. And I think all these countries are very much aware that if things do escalate, they may need to choose a side right away instead of giving mixed messages, because they want to be on the side of the victors in this peacekeeping Middle Eastern operation, or whatever you want to call it, the great international intervention into Iran to overthrow the rogue extremist Shia regime, which is what this will be framed as once the dust settles.
Unfortunately, at this point, I don't think the question is, will the strikes occur? Obviously, the question is when, as well as how extensive will they be? And this is a report from antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. It says Pentagon agency believes U.S. needs to drop a nuke to destroy Iran's Fordo nuclear plant. The Pentagon's Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, has told U.S. officials that in order to destroy Iran's Fordo nuclear plant, which is buried deep underground, the U.S. may need to drop a nuclear weapon, The Guardian has reported. According to the report, Pentagon officials who received the briefing were told that dropping GBU-57's conventional 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs would not penetrate deep enough underground and that it would only do enough damage to collapse tunnels and bury the facility under rubble. The officials were told that in order to destroy Fordo completely, the U.S. would likely need to first soften the ground with conventional bombs and then ultimately drop a tactical nuclear weapon from a B-2 bomber. The report said that President Trump is not considering using a nuclear weapon, that the option was not presented to him by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. According to a report from Axios, Trump is casting doubt on the idea that the GBU-57s could do enough damage to destroy the facility. So obviously they're presenting the fact that Trump doesn't think we can do enough damage as a reason why he's hesitating on this. But unfortunately, all that means is that he's aware that bombing likely entails more extensive involvement in the conflict on behalf of Israel to the point of boots on the ground or just a much more, because again, even if we don't put boots on the ground, we can imagine what we've done to Ukraine on steroids for Israel. Like we can do so much more than we even did for Ukraine and what we can do for Israel. So many more personnel on the ground for air defense purposes, all these sorts of things. And ultimately, boots on the ground at this point is, again, I'm not predicting it, but it's definitely not out of the question. And there is probably more likelihood that that has been about to occur than there has been at any time, especially during any time when Trump was president. At this point, even more than the Soleimani assassination, the Syria strikes back in 2017, more than any of that. And at this point, we're getting reports that Iranian ballistic missiles are likely to launch from Israel sometime in the next 15 to launch for Israel, rather, sometime in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Israel is striking all over Iran throughout the night, especially near critical nuclear sites, specifically in Isfahan and near Fordo. So many are saying it's going to be a long night for Iranian air defense. And I think, again, maybe we see a few days of peppering of these areas to prep for the strike. Maybe these are preceding the strike by a few hours. People need to realize how, again, this was literally prophesied that eventually the events would become so numerous and hard to follow that sort of covering them and following them the way that we have been for the past 3 years is becoming very, very difficult. Thankfully, it was timed well with my increase in content output and live streaming, but we got to make sure we're praying for everything going on. Obviously, the other things that have occurred in this region include the Houthis continuing to fire on Israel. They've even threatened to start their blockade on the Red Sea and striking U.S. and other merchant naval vessels if the U.S. joins in with Israel. So we have to be careful about that. I think the Houthis, again, they've proven that they're pretty much immune to attempts to be overthrown by aerial campaigns. And I don't know how capable the UAE and Saudi Arabia are of mounting some kind of ground campaign against them. The other big developments are Israel struck Lebanon once again and took out a close advisor of former Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, I think one of his bodyguards, a high-level figure. Hezbollah, of course, has said that they are going to enter the conflict if Iran is struck, that they're not neutrals. So I guess they still have some missiles. I don't know the extent of their current capabilities, but it would make sense that they would enter the conflict at this point. And of course, hundreds of Palestinians are still being killed pretty much daily in Gaza at this point, which you'd think that the Israelis would be redirecting their ire elsewhere, or maybe they'd even be reflecting on their genocidal actions as hell sort of rains down on them from Iran. But unfortunately, they hold up. I'm seeing reports right now the United States has struck the Fordo nuclear facility. Your thoughts, Dimitri?
Well, as we just said, it's to 2 weeks that Trump apparently gave us was, again, a ruse. He must have walked into he must have met up with the military leadership of the U.S. and they've come to a conclusion that Bibi Netanyahu requires the assistance now. And the leash was
Donald Trump, he says, we have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. All planes are now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordo. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. There's not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Iran is not going to have peace after this just happened. This is just an unprecedented escalation. I think we can expect not just yeah, those American bases now, I hope they're evacuating, or at least they're hiding in their bunkers, and it's very concerning, actually. Most likely, yeah, we'll see potential escalation from the Houthis, Hezbollah, Iranian proxies in Iraq. Yeah, Iran will not allow this to, because this would mean, Conrad, the death of not just military officials in those facilities, but as we said, civilians. Those nuclear scientists and those physicists working at these facilities are not official military targets. The U.S. has just killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranians on the ground, as well as some of these major
I
energy.
mean, I guess
Yeah,
we're going to see. I've seen nothing about the effectiveness of the strikes. I've seen no images. I've seen no videos. Wow. I mean, I don't
yeah,
even, at this point we're in, I mean, I don't even know what, I mean, this recording is still going. I don't know how much of this we're even going to release. We already had 55 plus minutes of analysis before the strikes occurred. So I don't even know what to do right now. We're here. I wish we had been, God, we should have gone live, brother. Damn.
yeah. Emergency broadcast.
That would
Um,
have been crazy to catch this live,
no,
but
but
wow.
as we said, right, could have been in the literal hour post this recording that this could have happened, and this is really unfortunate. I think Donald J. Trump has made a huge mistake. Potentially, he's killed Russians as well. Again, we don't know. We don't know if these strikes were successful. We've never seen these bunker buster bombs actually used on actual targets before, and all the information we've received about these nuclear facilities, Conrad, to a large extent, have been from internal leaks from Iran, as well as foreign espionage. So, what exactly have they taken out? Is Iran going to retaliate? I think we can only really speculate in the short term. However, it's very clear that the Iranian regime, to this point, has not essentially shown any decision to stand down after Israel. So, I think there's a likely chance that they will declare America as an antagonist, as someone who has officially entered into the war against them. I know, they're completely justified in doing so, right? Clearly, America has just breached Iranian sovereignty. They've officially entered into the conflict. We just have to call it what it is. The peacetime president has officially bombed a country more than Obama has. Like this is a much more serious ordeal than what we've seen before. So Joe Biden, in some cases, can be described as a peacetime president, if anything.
At this point, despite the fact that Biden oversaw the outbreak of the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, Trump has now done more than Biden ever did. Biden didn't, no American airstrikes occurred on a new target, namely Iran or Ukraine under Biden. Yet here we are. And again, I know people said, like, I mean, I told past people are always like, nothing ever happens, nothing ever happens, nothing ever happens. And I think it's funny. It's a good meme. I always, I'm not trying to be that guy, but we all said that when things start happening, we're going to beg for the nothing ever happens guy to come back. And right now, unfortunately, he's got a noose tied around the rafters and he's hanging, he's swinging. And it appears that the Iranian journalists are saying tonight's attacks were not Israeli attacks. So, yep, obviously Trump confirmed it. There's no there's no other way that it would be confirmed. So here we are. Again, I don't know what we're going to do with this recording. I'm glad I got my recording, my live reaction. Maybe I'll be able to post that and we can post like the 10-minute of recording that we did there. But at this point, I'm very, very curious to see how China and Russia are going to respond. I mean, this is so soon after Putin's recent remarks that I'm not sure what they're going to do. I really, at this point, we are truly in uncharted territory. It said that all of the planes were out of range. So clearly the OSINT community, as it were, was completely in the dark, which would make sense. I'm very curious as to see what Iran's response was. I'm wondering if any footage will be released. Obviously, the 97+% Wi-Fi internet outage in Iran is going to prevent us from getting a lot of any form of analysis or content, not even just of what, let alone of what happened, but even of what's going on in the streets right now, how people are responding. I'm sure people are taking to the streets. We already saw people calling for escalations against Israel based on what they're doing. I'm sure we're now going to be seeing Iranian civilians in the streets calling for strikes on American bases. And I'm very curious as to how China and Russia are going to respond. But I mean, Dimitri, if you have anything to say about what else was going on this week in Russia, I mean, it almost seems trite to bring up anything else right now, but
No,
it wasn't just at
yeah,
Fordo, it was also at Natanz and Esfahan. So those reports that I was talking about of these peppering, of these striking of these air defenses, this might have been the closest thing that, open source intelligence was picking up about the ongoing strikes. So I think here in the next few minutes or hour, we're going to learn what really went down.
Yeah, no, this is horrific because we may be speaking about an event that has directly led us into the hottest phase of the Third World War. So it's a little bit daunting in that regard, but we'll try to keep sober and give a little level-headed analysis here, sort of as it happens. I'd just like to point out that most likely Trump did not give Putin any indication that this strike will take place. I think this was a complete surprise. And I think Russian as well as Chinese officials right now, probably they had a hypothetical scenario in their minds as, okay, what can we do? But this has surprised, I think, everyone that Trump has shown such decisiveness. Like he is well and truly showing himself as, like a World War II equivalent president of the US who is willing to take extreme measures in order to push American interests abroad. But we know these are not truly American interests. They're interests of a very dark, shady lobby. This is officially marking Trump as the most Zionist president in U.S. history, because nobody else has done as much as he has over the last two presidencies. But keeping in mind, President Putin literally stated in an interview this week, Conrad, right, in a roundtable discussion, essentially, prior to the economic speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, that there are hundreds of Russian nuclear scientists and physicists working in Iran. He didn't say where they were working. He said they're not leaving. He said we're not going to tell them to leave. So what is the response going to be from Russia, I think? Because there aren't any Chinese nuclear scientists working in these facilities, we know for sure. Maybe singular individuals at best, maybe hired contractors and experts. But we know Russia is the leading nation which has, I think, experts in terms of nuclear technology and uranium enrichment. And, the fact that Trump has called for peace after striking essentially what, at the moment, by the way, it's not even proven that these facilities were enriching uranium to a weapon-grade level. Trump has outdone Netanyahu in some regards because he's essentially taken intelligence on board. This is like the Iraq War WMD theory that was pushed by the George W. Bush government. So just keep that in mind. I think all the BRICS countries at the moment are very, very much they're in a bit of a conundrum as to how to respond. And I'm not exactly sure we'll even have a response in the next few hours. If you recall, Russia's very hesitant in terms of giving hasty takes. But I'll just cover the brief news, which may, again, it may literally be like a mosquito bites in terms of on the field of the world affairs at the moment, what's taking place in Russia. So very stable on all fronts, except, of course, in Kupiansk, Donetsk, and the Sumskaya Oblast. So a lot of fighting in Kharkov, as per usual. The Russians aren't really progressing that far. Russians are becoming a lot more hawkish on their television. So they're very much calling for increased strikes against Kiev. There have been immense strikes against, in particular, Kiev as well as Western Ukraine over the past week. Many drones, long-range Russian missile strikes. Yeah, feel free to interrupt me, Conrad, if anything else comes up, of course. But there's been...
No, I haven't, again, I think we're all watching. Everyone's just U.S. bases have raised their alerts to maximum.
As they should,
Iranian monitoring channels did report warplanes over central Iran an hour ago. However, the reports weren't confirmed then. So, yeah, that's what we're seeing right now. I think everyone's watching and waiting. I think at this point, the real red pill is that this wasn't going to happen unless we started recording the show. So we started recording the show. They deduced that they were going to cook us on a solid hour of analysis. So then they did the airstrikes. So you're welcome, I guess.
To be completely fair,
or sorry.
Our analysis essentially already foretold, well, no, not foretold, but essentially predicted this eventuality from taking place. We did say like 60% plus chance, 75% chance that this will take place. But yes, in fact, it has. I guess the cherry on top of the cake, the red lining here, Conrad, is that nuclear missiles weren't used, at least. And we know that for sure, because if they were, Trump would have probably mentioned it in his tweet. So we know these were bunker buster bombs. I'm generally sure, again, purely speculative, we don't know what kind of munitions were used, because the B-2 bombers most likely dropped these missiles. They were the bunker busters. They weren't nuclear in nature. And Israel hasn't used nuclear weaponry against Iran yet. And now that these facilities are destroyed, Conrad, unless Iran escalates to the highest point, that is, uses hypersonics against all of its entire load against Israel, against Western Jerusalem, against Haifa, against Tel Aviv, against the US bases, the US aircraft carriers, then the nuclear scenario comes into play. Because right now it would look entirely unreasonable if Israel would begin to use nuclear weaponry. But just briefly going back to Sumska Oblast, Russians and Ukrainians have been making, there's a lot of fighting, heavy conflict all over Sumy as the Russians are approaching the capital of that oblast, essentially extending the buffer zone, and the Ukrainians are getting more and more desperate. There's actually footage of really horrific footage. We won't describe it in too much depth, but Ukrainians have shown as footage of them executing 12 Russian POWs in the Sumska Oblast, just outright execution style. Can't really say anything about that in terms of, like, we've seen footage of Ukrainians executing Russian POWs before, but they're trying to essentially demoralize the Russian troops by saying that, look, if we catch you in our territory in Sumy, we will basically execute you on site. Russians have been shooting down UAVs, aerial guided missiles. The Ukrainians are still aiming at Russian refinery facilities all over the adjacent oblast here to Ukraine at the moment. You know, especially the SMO zones. So the Russians are definitely on the offensive, still progressing very steadily. And the other concerning news from Russia at the moment, Conrad, in terms of like domestic politics, is that, and we have to mention this is related to the war because, for example, Maxim Kalashnikov, who I trust very much in his military analysis, he's been to the front. He's raised so much money for the Russian troops, and he's funded directly Russian volunteer brigades and other battalions. He stated that at the moment, I think if Russia is going to reach some sort of agreement with Ukraine in the next coming months, there's going to be a complete shutdown of any Russian, shall we say, patriotic opposition to the so-called Minsk III or Istanbul II agreements, right, coming down. For example, former governor of Novorossiya, Pavel Gubaryov, has officially stated on his Telegram, he's put out almost a Fed-level post where he said that if you're living in any of the SMO zones or adjacent zones to Ukraine, and the Russian government tells you to hand in your weapons that you've picked up from Ukraine, or you've been, if any Russians have obtained AK-47s or other rifles or other military equipment, the Russian government is going to ask them to be returned, right, to the military. Pavel Gubaryov says, do not give your guns back if you have them. If Russia signs any ceasefire or peace treaty with Ukraine, you must hide your weapons, retain them. And he hasn't been in prison yet. So it's fairly interesting message, as well as the Section 282, the anti-Russian, the anti-Semitic article in the Russian criminal code has been officially criminalized again. The penalties have been harshened. So if the Russian government, if the courts in Russia deem you to be spreading not just anti-Semitic, but some sort of propaganda which agitates against a group of people, it's very vague in the wording, you may be almost automatically not just fined, not just sent to do some sort of community service of some sort, but you can be sent to prison between 2 to 5 years minimum sentence. So the Russian government is, for some reason, clamping down on, I would just say, the anti-immigrant rhetoric taking place right now, as well as some of maybe potential anti-Semitic remarks that Russian soldiers have been making in relation to the Ukrainian war. This is very bad news. At the same time, there's a very interesting Russian correspondent. He runs a Telegram channel. It has 75,000 members, so it's quite large. Mikhail Polinkov, he's a Russian veteran. He's been with Strelkov since 2014. He actually, at the moment, because of illness, he had to leave the SMO front lines. He never actually enlisted in the Russian official army, by the way. He's always been in these volunteer brigades. His house was raided by police after he released a clip of Vladimir Solovyov-Shapiro stating that he's as pro-Israeli as he is pro-Russian. Essentially, the clip could have been interpreted as essentially Mikhail Polinkov was maybe trying to be anti-Semitic towards Vladimir Shapiro-Solovyov, and his house was raided and he was taken into custody. This is a big ally of Igor Strelkov. He's a big Russian public military figure, I would say. And it's very concerning. A lot of Russians are saying that the government is about to start essentially clamping down and essentially tightening restrictions on all these so-called right-wing patriots who are a little bit too right-wing and a bit too patriotic and too nationalistic for the liking of United Russia and and President Putin and his cabinet, which is very concerning. There's news about potentially Igor Strelkov appealing his court decision as well. So Russians are fundraising to pay his lawyers and his attorneys in the next coming up court hearing. So that's very good news because he has actually sat for quite a large portion of his sentencing already. So there's very, very dire concerns domestically. There's also calls for a top Chechen and all kinds of Central Asian diaspora officials, Conrad, within Russia itself to shut down the Russian community. So Ruskaya Общina which Andrei Afanasyev, who we've interviewed twice on our show, runs. This is the Russian community, which essentially it's not even a political group. It's just a group for Russian nationalists to fight back against illegal migrant crime and legal migrant crime across Russia. It's a very great organization. The Muslims within Russia have begun attacking it officially. Almost, I think it's sanctioned by Kadyrov. So there's very concerning things happening domestically in Russia as well as on the front lines. As Russia pushes forward, there's chances of Ukrainian escalation in terms of war crimes and further things. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that develops. And this kind of flows directly into church news, which we'll discuss, because again, the persecutions are picking up, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode. But generally speaking, Russia at the moment is looking like it's transforming under pressure from the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I think the Russian government in general is trying to react to two conflicts at once, right? The Israeli-Iranian conflict, as well as the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And whether or not the ceasefire sort of is reached, any sort of agreement, which at the moment it doesn't look like, at the moment it doesn't look very likely, especially given that Zelensky, I'm not sure if you saw his tweet recently, Conrad, he's put out a tweet requesting that all the allied nations of Ukraine provide Ukraine $40 billion, American dollars, annually in order to sustain the Ukrainian military, which is currently operational, as a vanguard against Russian expansion. Now, for reference, $40 billion American dollars is almost the budget of, it's larger than the Polish military budget, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's almost as large as the German military budget. The French military budget per year is about $52 billion. So we're talking about giant numbers that Zelensky is requesting. And his request, as well as some of the other rhetoric he's been putting out, is sort of pushing us towards considering that maybe the Zelensky government is in fact not looking towards a potential ceasefire because the Russians are just requesting way too much. And Putin has emphasized that Ukraine still needs to be denazified. Let's just mention quickly his recent statements. He essentially says that Zelensky is a toxic figure, but he's willing to sit down with him anyway, potentially, and that he's ready, and Moscow is ready for further negotiations. It's almost like Kiev is not ready for negotiations, but Moscow suddenly wants to at least settle things with Ukraine. At least Putin is putting this sort of information out there. This is completely contradictory to what Putin was saying last year when he was proclaiming Zelensky as an illegitimate president. So very strange sort of conclusions he's coming to. And again, Putin re-emphasizes that Ukraine needs to recognize the referendums in the four regions, so Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk. Again, I don't know why Putin keeps harping on the legalities here. I don't think the referendums, for example, in Zaporozhye, and I'm speaking strictly from even a very basic perspective, the referendum that took place in Zaporozhye, the people that voted in it were maybe 40% of the population of the oblast itself, because 60% or so actually lived in Ukrainian Zaporozhye. So how can you count that referendum as being legitimate? I'm not too sure. I think that's just outright political misinformation and maybe kind of manipulated from the Russian side in some way, that President Putin is saying the referendum means anything. And in fact, why should a referendum be the measuring stick by which certain regions, I guess it does show some sort of consensus of people, and it does show the democratic appeal that an oblast has and what exactly the people wish, which country they wish to join. But still, two of these referendums, at the very least, the Kherson referendum as well as the Zaporozhye referendum, can be put very easily into question by the international community, even by some of Russia's allies, like some of the BRICS countries, which frankly haven't officially even recognized a lot of these regions. We just have to keep that in mind. So this is what I think Putin is stressing here. And I do think this lukewarmness by Russia, Conrad, is what led to the U.S. disrespecting. Like, the failures of Russia in Ukraine has led the Trump administration to believe they can do whatever they want in the Middle East without any further reprisals. Like, this is one conflict directly influences the other. Russian indecisiveness in Eastern Europe has led to essentially the US and its allies, including Israel, acting completely out of pocket, so to speak, arrogantly, unhingedly in both Syria and Iran. And what we see today is, in some capacity, and I don't want to blame Russia for everything, because here again, they're on the defensive, right? All of NATO is against them. But we have to keep in mind, perception of strength is a very powerful thing. Like, unfortunately, power is very much the one and only element which these worldly Satanists actually understand and which they come to terms with. And so Russia hasn't shown that in Ukraine necessarily over the past 3 years. Like, the conflict is already almost longer than the First World War. for the Russian Federation. It's extremely lengthy, and the results, shall we say, are very far from being satisfactory, especially with the loss of Kherson and the Russia never actually entering into Zaporozhye city. So very concerning. But in any case, President Putin has shown solidarity with Iran generally, but we'll see exactly what that turns into after these events, which are just transpiring right now.
Well, the latest reports, of course, this is from Iranian journalist Ilya Hashemi. The Fordo facility was targeted by B-2 bombers and dozens of tons of bunker-busting bombs. Reports out of Iran right now, some of the most heavy wide-spectrum jamming of the war, radios, GPS, and cell, all experiencing heavy degradation, most likely U.S. electronic warfare supporting the strikes. Axios, mainstream outlet, is saying things like Trump's decision to directly intervene in support of Israel to dismantle Iran's nuclear program represents a historic escalation in the Middle East. And the reports are saying right now that Trump is going to address the nation sometime later this evening. I don't know if that's being rescinded or not, but there's apparently just widespread strikes reporting across Iran right now. I'm sure the Israelis are probably attacking in tandem at other sites after the Iranian strike occurred, after the American strike occurred. And of course, the Israelis were briefed. We've gotten that confirmed that the Israelis were completely briefed on this plan, which, I mean, of course they would be. But yeah, the New York Times is saying that Trump will address the nation later. His Truth Social post was talking all about, in full, it was a full payload of bombs was dropped. There is not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So I'm assuming he's not going to get on the air and be like, we are now at full war with Iran. We're going to destroy them. But unfortunately, his address will likely come before the Iranian response, or maybe it won't. I don't know how they're going to time this, but the Iranians have already said that they will need to respond. And I'm assuming that will be a fairly unprecedented strike on American bases in the region, which, again, seem to have largely been evacuated. I'm not sure how many personnel are on the ground here, but the Iranians have claimed that they even have, unprecedented, surprises that they could deploy. They have hinted at that before. So I'm curious what that would mean. Right now, we see Trump's Truth Social has gone offline. I'm wondering if this is an Iranian cyber attack, but everything going on in Russia, Dmitry, so much of what you said is true, especially the analysis about, look, if Russia had been able to actually somewhat embarrass NATO and the Western forces in Ukraine, more so than they've already been embarrassed, then perhaps you're right, Iran wouldn't be in the pickle that it's in right now. But we're getting here that Trump will address the nation at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at the White House. So that's in about an hour and 45 minutes. Perhaps we could get this episode released before then. I'm not sure on the timing here, but we will be sure to keep you all updated. Be sure to follow us on the socials, obviously. But as far as the rest of the news we want to bring you on this show, I think that's just going to be church news. And of course, I'm going to keep you posted to what happens for the rest of this episode there. But Dmitry, do you have any updates regarding church persecutions in Ukraine or any other church news going on around the world?
Of course, yes. Just briefly moving on to church news, and I completely agree, Conrad. The situation, of course, is changing on the front, and yeah, there may need to be an emergency broadcast later this week. So definitely keep your eye out on the YouTube channel, on the Substack, follow our social media, because you'll need to see what we have to say about this, because we've been essentially accurately predicting this for over 6 months now. Very unfortunately, so I would say since January, if not December last year. Two big stories, both of which are somewhat negative and positive, right? There's goods and bads to both of them. One of them is that Patriarch Kirill officially responded in an interview, and this is published on the patriarchia.ru website, the official Patriarchate of Moscow website. He stated that the priest, so Schema Hegumen Gabriel of Valaam, who was recently suspended, Patriarch Kirill confirmed that it was actually he suspended him. So the Russian Patriarchate, not the local bishop, but the actual official Russian synod suspended that particular Schema Hegumen priest for his statement against the Islamic migrants and the potential of Islamic immigrant crime, which is completely true, by the way. But Patriarch Kirill, in an interview, and it was published on the Patriarchia website, and I'll just read it out for you, and then I'll give my commentary, because I think this can be interpreted one of two ways, but mostly in a negative way. And we just have to, be respectful here. But he states, Well, I've spoken out about this priest. This is a real provocation at a time when the Orthodox and Muslims are fighting together with weapons in hand, when the best representatives of Islam support Orthodoxy, including those places where they are the majority, for example. In Chechnya, the Orthodox do not experience any oppression. At this very time, only a madman or a person with evil intentions can provoke an Orthodox Islamic conflict. And the Patriarch continues, we have something in common with Muslims. We believe in one God. We have something in common, although relatively common, in terms of self-restraints that people impose on themselves in the name of God. They have their fasts, we have ours. There are also things that really do not correspond to our culture. For example, polygamy, although officially it is prohibited in Russia. The Christian understanding of marriage is completely different. But despite these differences, Orthodox Christians and Muslims today have a common goal. This is the concern for the motherland, for Russia. How many Muslims are now dying defending the motherland? And he continues on, but this was the most controversial paragraph here, especially the first sentence. We have something in common with Muslims. We believe in one God. Many have interpreted this as in Patriarch Kirill simply stating something quasi-heretical, which is, he made a straight-up direct theological mistake in speech, right, where he says that essentially the Muslim Quranic Allah is equivalent to the Holy Trinity or God the Father or something like this, which is completely false and wrong. We don't even need to go into the details as to why. Any church father would confirm this starting from St. John of Damascus, right? So this is Orthodox normative teaching that Muslims and Christians do not believe in the same God, okay? So this is the starting point. However, what Patriarch Kirill may have meant is that we're both monotheistic, which is a very loose, or maybe what he meant was we're both Abrahamic, we're both monotheistic, which again is a very loose sort of commonality, I would say, especially since they do call, the Muslims refer to the Holy Trinity as being polytheistic in nature. So it's not a mutual really understanding of monotheism, so to speak. They don't call us monotheists, for example, and then they would never admit to doing so. Their official teaching is that we're polytheists. So Patriarch Kirill really has, I think, overstepped here, and I'm not sure how many church fathers he actually reads or Islamic apologists. Has he actually looked into what the Orthodox view of Islam is? What I know for sure, Conrad, and I can say this very adamantly, strongly, that Patriarch Kirill has most likely, based on this interview, has not watched either the priest's sermon, which contained the excerpt regarding Muslim potential crime, especially Muslim migrant crime. He specified the priest didn't say anything about Chechens committing the crime. He said the Central Asian migrants, right? That was the context. Patriarch Kirill doesn't mention migrants. He essentially just speaks about native Russian Muslims, which the priest wasn't talking about. So it almost feels as if someone whispered into Patriarch Kirill's ear or gave him the wrong briefing or took information completely out of context, lied to the Patriarch, and then asked him to give a hot take, which then would be published on the official website. So Patriarch Kirill has been misinformed, or he's personally twisting and reframing the information. I hope it's the former, very, very much. But we do have to call this out. Patriarch Kirill is completely incorrect in terms of, we believe in one God. We do not. The Quranic Allah is different from the Holy Trinity. And the Muslims themselves would agree with us here. So this is entirely concerning. The good news, however, in this Father Gabriel's situation with General Abtialo Udinov, which we covered not last week but the week prior to that, is that Abtialo Udinov actually traveled to Valam. He met with the schema monk personally, and they had a Russian nationalist from Sorakov actually sit between them. This is a big Russian sort of nationalist organization between Russia. He was like the middleman here. And for 22 minutes, they spoke about how much they respect each other. And the General Abtialo Udinov personally apologized to the priest for calling him a retard investments, right, weeks prior, which was very disrespectful. So it's very good. So someone pressured this general to travel all the way to Valam in North Russia, in Karelia, to apologize to this priest. Or perhaps the general himself, he actually understood, his consciousness was like, okay, look, I actually need to prove myself to be a real man, travel all the way, like hundreds of kilometers up north in order to meet up with the priest and actually be very manly about it, which I hope that's the case. But in any circumstance, Conrad, it does matter. Look, because we mentioned it on our podcast, as well as many other Russians have spoken about this on their channels. A lot of Russian, shall we say, like political influencers have spoken out about this controversy in a negative fashion towards the Chechen general. I think they've influenced the way in how the general responded. So it's true, you can in fact influence how people, the public, the citizenry of Russia, the Orthodox Christians, they need to remain active in the political realm, in the multimedia realm, in alt media, because they can actually influence results. As per here, this is a great resolution. The fact that the general essentially came to the table. Patriarch Kirill's response and the fact that he continues to suspend the priests is very, I think, negative, perhaps even reprehensible. I don't think it's appropriate at all. I think the priest's sermons are very good. Most of his sermons don't even speak about Muslims. He speaks about, as we said, saints, Tsar Nicholas II, great things. I think it's just very unfortunate that Russia at the moment is suppressing priests who are outspoken in any way. And I can almost guarantee, and this is the very sad thing, I'll mention this just once, I can guarantee that if a priest gave a similar sermon and he mentioned, for example, certain anti-Semitic remarks in Russia, possibly a similar approach could be taken towards them from the Russian ADL, which is the Feor, run by Rabbi Beryl Lazar, Rabbi Alexander Boroda. And Feor is the Russian ADL. It's been working since the 1990s. They've already suppressed many Orthodox Christians in the past. They've made calls to the Russian Prosecutor General's office. They've had a lot of Russian patriots and Orthodox Christians arrested in the past. So it's very concerning that, this is the current position, that Russia is in this sort of endless war state. And so the church in some way has to keep this solidarity between Muslims and Christians going, right? And in doing so, it acts in a quasi-Sergionist fashion and sort of goes against its own long-term interests and the Orthodox priests. And I don't mean the church, I mean the clergy in particular. It seems like the higher-ups, the clergy really see that they need to work with the Russian government in terms of, in order to push their interests forward. And this is, I think, very concerning news. But, we needed to call it out. We can't just say all the good things about the Russian Patriarchate, the Moscow Patriarchate, and then deny clear mistakes here, because this has been critiqued already in the Russian media sphere by many pious, conservative Russian Orthodox Christians. And again, Conrad, we do have to mention, if Metropolitan Tikhon of Simferopol in Crimea was the Patriarch today, I doubt he would have ever said something like that. He's a much smarter man. He knows his theology well. In terms of, I even think he's wiser than Patriarch Kirill in some regards, because he's, in the past, he said things which Russian clergy would never say in terms of if they had any sense of self-preservation, so to speak. He's mentioned historical facts which, again, hurt the reputation of Russian clergy historically. He's called out Sergionism as well, to a large extent. So Metropolitan Tikhon, he would never say something like, we have something in common with Muslims, we live in one God. Such a ambiguous and potentially dangerous spiritual statement would never come out of his mouth. So we just have to say it how it is here. And the very big news from Ukraine, and generally this is negative, in the Oblast of Chernovtsi, a cathedral was actually raided by Ukrainian radicals. Essentially a militia entered the church. They began hitting the clergy, hitting the laity. This happened in broad daylight, not at night. There was footage of priests and priests bloodied. I think they were struck over the head with blunt objects. Ukrainians entered into the church. Most likely they were trying to steal the antimints as well as certain icons and other relics. And they actually took the entire cathedral over, following which police actually attended the scene. Well, how surprising. Ukrainian police actually attend the scene for the first time when a church is being raided, and they've used excessive amounts of tear gas, surprisingly. But the tear gas was mostly aimed at the pious Orthodox Christians who gathered to take the church back. And so the actual metropolitan of Chernovtsi, the city, Metropolitan Meletios, he was one of the men outside of the cathedral, because inside of the cathedral was basically occupied by these militant Ukrainian banderites, and he was tear gassed. And the Metropolitan was essentially, he had tears streaming down his face, and he looked very bad. He was coughing. It was horrible to see a Metropolitan in such a condition, and he was escorted away. Yeah,
awful.
Yeah, it's just horrible. And then he gave a very strong sermon the day after. This was later this week, in which he again condemns the Ukrainian government for not responding on time and even allowing such groups to even exist within Ukraine that can at any moment attend any parish church or monastery, right? Remember how he said in June, the persecution will escalate, and this could be the first one of those major events where you have bloodied priests, beaten clergy, beaten laity, etc. This is getting very bad, and I think with the Zelensky government sort of in their desperation, they're going to start striking out against the one thing which again gives Ukrainians the most spiritual well-being, that is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine under Metropolitan Onufry. So this is a clear escalation here. The good news is, however, that the police actually escorted the Banderite militia out. I don't know if any charges were laid, but the cathedral remains in Orthodox Christian hands, which is why when Metropolitan Meletius gave his sermon, he actually gave it from inside of the cathedral, which was previously occupied. So, at least in this particular case, the OCU, Sergei Dumenko, the false patriarch, the false metropolitan, of Kiev, hasn't succeeded in occupying another major cathedral of the country. So that's very good. The police at least acted in some way appropriately, but I doubt the Ukrainian prosecutor is going to put charges on these people for literally physically assaulting clergy as well as laity, for taking over a church essentially, which doesn't belong to them. Yeah, just really bad news. But this may be just the first steps for this tyrannical, I would say, Talmudic, openly Zionist Ukrainian regime in its marks against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now that officially any Ukrainian Orthodox parish, church, monastery which has ties to the Moscow Patriarchate on paper at all is officially outlawed and banned. So they can officially raid any church they would like, and police can do this, not just these random militias. The doors are now wide open for persecution in Ukraine. They have complete legality to do so. And again, legality doesn't always correlate with more morality and ethics, as we can clearly understand now from what's happening around the world. So good news and bad news. And sort of the last brief story is Metropolitan Longin of Banshen, who we discussed, the long-suffering, a confessor of the faith, literally, even maybe a new martyr if the Ukrainians escalate their attacks against them, has openly stated in a sermon, this is very powerful because he was very pro-Ukrainian prior to the SMO, and even during the SMO, he kept sustaining his support for Ukraine and essentially trying to even help the Ukrainian troops in some way, spiritually speaking. But he openly said that if any Orthodox Christian Ukrainian is seeing that their brothers and sisters are being taken and kidnapped, forcefully, essentially conscripted by the Ukrainian Tetsaka, so these are the Ukrainian officials, the guards who take you into the vans and trucks and take you to the military training camps, essentially, and then you're shipped into the trenches with minimal training. These forced conscriptors need to be opposed. So if he told his laity, and I think he spoke to all Ukrainian Orthodox Christians in this way, he said, look, Metropolitan Longin stated, if you see anyone on the street being taken by these Ukrainian officials, you have to help them. You have to help the people being taken, help the victims, help your brothers and sisters in Christ. And this is super powerful. So he's essentially calling for Orthodox Christians in Ukraine to resist the tyrannical authority of Zelensky. This is very, very powerful, unprecedented, very unprecedented for a metropolitan to make such a statement. And that's very good. I think even if they imprison him after what he just said, it will be, he's already a confessor in the faith, but he'll be even more so a saint in the eyes of not just the local Ukrainians, but all the Orthodox Christians around the world. This is exactly what needed to happen. Ukrainians need to resist being forcefully thrown into a war, which frankly isn't even about them. It's about some greater interests of shady, evil entities around the world. And again, Ukrainians are simply being used as pawns and tools in the hands of, shall we say, the greater satanic globalist New World Order.
No, it's really unfortunate news. The footage from the cathedral was just terrible and tragic to see. It's crazy that this late in the game they're still doing this as they lose and retreat on the front line. They still are dead set on provoking the wrath of God, as far as I can tell. But before I give you also a quick updates on the news and bigger updates before Trump's address, obviously the big news, the good news is the glorification of St. Olga of Alaska occurred up by the OCA in Alaska in her native village of Kwethluk, which is, again, in rural Orthodox Alaska. She herself was, I believe she was Aleutian of the Aleut tribe. She was a Matishka, a wife of a priest. She had 13 children, I believe. 5 of them died in infancy, but she considered a very beloved saint by Americans in North America, especially in Alaska. So Metropolitan Tikhon, Metropolitan Alexei, they were up there for the OCA to canonize this wonderful saint. And this is obviously, people have already been venerating her, making icons with her with the halos and everything for a long time, especially ever since she was announced for canonization. But it's official. She is now a saint in the Orthodox Church. November 8th, 2024, that was the 45th anniversary of her repose. And on November 16th of last year, her relics were solemnly uncovered in Kwethluk. Last night, her precious relics were in the center of the church, the all-night vigil, as her glorification was celebrated. The Diocese of Alaska worked tirelessly leading up to the celebration, preparing the remote village of Kwethluk to receive hundreds of pilgrims, including hierarchs, clergy, monastics, and faithful. President at the Vigil, or Metropolitan Tikon, local hierarchs, Bishop Alexei, Bishop Michael of New York, Daniel of Chicago, Bishop Gerasim of Fort Worth, Andre of Cleveland, and Nicodemus of the Albanian Archdiocese. The OCA hierarchs were also joined by His Grace Bishop James of Sonora from the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So great to see a very important saint, of course, in the Russian patronage, and of course, most importantly, in the American Orthodox Church. So St. Olga Valaska, pray for us. But more updates here from the situation in Iran. Netanyahu is currently in an emergency cabinet meeting. The news is that 4 to 6 of the B-2 bombers were used in the strike, and those recent posts we were making about the ones going to Guam and passing forward to Guam to potentially go to Diego Garcia, those likely just were the strikers that did the bombers that did the attack. Rurim Navarim has posted a rough timeline here with the time zones in Iranian time. So pre-1 a.m., Israeli drones activated air defenses in several Iranian regions. 1:14 a.m., fighter jets were heard over Shiraz. At 1:22 a.m., several aircraft were heard over central Iran. At 2:04 a.m., 2 bomber jets and an explosion were heard near Qom. Qom's countryside is the site of Fordo. At 2:13 a.m., an explosion was heard near Kashan, another city near Fordo. At 2:38 a.m., an explosion was heard at Fordo, but it was assumed a drone was intercepted, which has now been proven wrong. At 2:41 a.m., a loud explosion was heard at Isfahan's atomic energy facility. And at 2:46 a.m., an explosion was heard at the Natanz nuclear facility. And at 2:55 a.m., GPS jamming was observed across Iran. So at this point, U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere are likely blasting Iran with energy warfare, with disruptive signals, radar warfare, disrupting everything, GPS, internet signals. Again, the internet was already largely not available to most civilians from the government side, but at this point, I'm sure any form of electronic communication is very difficult in most parts of Iran. The U.S. State Department has just requested that all U.S. passport holders currently leave Iran by land. I would not want to personally be a U.S. passport holder in Iran right now. Apparently, the New York Times is openly saying that the U.S. has entered the war with Iran. Trump posted explicitly, I will be giving an address to the nation at 10 p.m. at the White House regarding our very successful military operation in Iran. This is a historic moment for the United States of America, Israel, and the world. Iran must now agree to end this war. Thank you. So he's calling it a war. We're a party in the war. The United States is at war with Iran. We are here. If you've been listening to World War Now, you are not surprised. So it's pretty crazy, obviously, that this happened while we were recording. I think we want to just post this, give you guys the perspective. I'll probably record a little segment to put at the beginning to warn everybody that our analysis, that we catch it live, so you kind of hear our analysis leading up to the strike. But this is some crazy stuff, and I don't know how much Trump's announcement is going to change things. We've already seen the Houthis openly saying that Washington must pay for this. Iranian proxy groups in Iraq are saying that fire will rain down on U.S. bases. Iran obviously very recently pledged to retaliate against U.S. bases, so that's clearly what is coming down in the near future. Clearly, Netanyahu in his emergency cabinet meeting is preparing for something bigger to come. The Israelis had already prepared for weeks and weeks and months of hostilities, and I think it's clear that the Israelis were very much aware that this was going to happen in June, whether Trump wanted it to or not. Let's put it that way, considering how CENTCOM and the rest of the military and intelligence apparatus fully wanted this to happen towards Israel's ends. And Trump clearly hopped on the cabinet and the train to, I don't know, maybe not get assassinated, if only to not look like a powerless fool, which at this point we pretty much understand that he is. The Israelis are in the control seat. They have the reins of the United States, and they control our entire military capabilities. So pray for the situation, everybody. Dimitri, I don't know if you have any final thoughts here on the strikes, but everyone needs to, of course, pray that nobody is hurt in the coming retaliation from Iran, and that whatever happens, again, at this point, a draft could happen in the United States if things go crazy enough. I'm not saying I'm predicting that, but at this point, many of our other predictions have come true, so I'm going to try to keep them modest. At this point, based on the prophecies, we're going to have to be looking at what's going on with Erdogan, what's going on in Turkey, how Putin is going to respond, how Xi is going to respond in China. It's important to note that this was I guess it was technically the morning of the 22nd in Iran, but, longest day of the year, summer solstice strike here. Very interesting. The sun has been up for a very long time. I'm here recording right now, 7:38 p.m. Central. Very much still sunny outside. Couldn't even really call it dusk yet, frankly. So interesting time to do this, but Again, we said the summer would tell the tale, and the summer is indeed telling the tale. We have President Trump had personally told Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu of the attack yesterday night over the phone, according to Israeli Channel 14. So Netanyahu knew well in advance. Darn, man, if only Bibi had agreed to come on the show, maybe he could have spilled the beans, right?
Yeah, I think in a comical fashion, Conrad, this was very, very telegraphed, especially in the last 48 hours. It's surprising how many news official sources began publishing information about the B-2 bombers, almost like advertising it in a capitalist type fashion, right? Especially Fox News. They were like, wow, these extreme epic bunker busters which we have can strike the facility and surgically destroy the nuclear reactors and nuclear facilities deep underground. It was so telegraphed, the movement of the US planes into the region. And I think what essentially really triggered my attention, Conrad, was, as you mentioned in the World War Now telegram, as soon as you posted the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier group, as soon as it entered into that Middle Eastern CENTCOM vicinity, Trump went into the room and the decision was made. So this was exactly calculated. It was not, so to speak, rushed. I can almost predict that in some ways, Israel's pre-strikes this entire week, commencing from last week again, was almost like preparing for this US plan. Which I believe, if it may come out in the near future, in decades, when after the Third World War is already finished, that it might come out that US and Israel collaborated on this particular operation jointly from the very beginning. This wasn't something that simply came about. And all those peace talks, there's 5 rounds of discussions with Iran, were all to buy time to prepare both the Israeli Air Force and the US to get into position to strike against Iran. And yes, we're very much in the Third World War now as we speak. So I would just want to thank all the listeners for sticking with us, this entire time, listening to our analysis. And unfortunately, we were correct to a large extent, especially over the last 6 to 7 months. So I'm very disappointed in MAGA, very disappointed in President Donald J. Trump and his cabinet, the Zionists that still, as you said, Conrad, hold the reins of power in America. So America is very much a nation occupied.
Unfortunately, that is very much the case. The Wikipedia page has officially added the United States as a co-belligerent with Israel in the Iran-Israel war, so it's in the history books. Initial information is now coming out that the U.S. did not use Iraqi airspace for this operation, so that could mean they came directly from Diego Garcia. I don't know if that means they'd have to come up through Oman or Saudi Arabia, but it appears that Iraq was not used here. Israel is openly saying they fully coordinated with the U.S. on this attack. So that's our situation right now. I could keep us on the recording here and keep reporting what Telegram is telling me, but I think it's probably good that we cut this off here. Be sure to stay tuned to World War Now, worldwarnow.co, the Substack. That's where we're going to be posting everything. Be sure to follow us on YouTube and on X. We're going to be going live, I'm sure, multiple times here in the next few days and weeks. I will be doing that probably even before my regularly scheduled Tuesday live stream. Be sure to check out our latest Ether Hour episode with Gregory Hears about Nikephoros Phokas, an emperor we believe to be a saint, in agreement with the great Lavras. So if you want to hear why we think he's a saint, about his life, his reconquest of Crete, Cyprus, other parts of the Eastern Roman Empire from the Islamists, as well as his financing of Mount Athos. We discuss all of these things on our episode that's going to be linked down below. Fantastic Ether Hour. Always great having Gregory on, but fateful events are transpiring, so follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Follow us on X at World War Now _. We're going to be posting about this regularly. We have a report here from Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. The war has begun. So I think that's probably a good piece of news to end things on, Dimitri. I'll give you some final thoughts here.
No, thank you everyone for listening. Keep Metropolitan Miletios, Metropolitan Longin in your prayers, and all the Christians in the Middle East at the moment, because what is about to take place and what has already been happening for the past 2 years, and we can even say decades, has been very tumultuous for the people living there. So keep all of them in your prayers. And yes, pray for myself and Conrad as well, because, all this coverage is very intense, especially on the psyche. We've been following this news so intensely, reading crazy amounts of information, including a lot of misinformation, disinformation, a lot of which I would say is borderline demonic, unfortunately, just to bring you guys the most up-to-date factual perspectives on what is taking place in the world today. So thank you everyone for listening. We always appreciate the support. Subscribe if you can, retweet, like, share the videos, because it does help us in the algorithm, especially on Substack and YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. We're always very grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for listening. It is later than you think. Hasten, therefore, to do the work of God. We'll see you on the next one.